Hi. So you might notice I have a little bit of a new sound setup, so things should sound a little better from here. So I'm excited about that. And I am somewhat equally excited about the topic that I have today, which is the underlying ideologies behind each political party. Of course, being American political parties so conservative and progressive. So, and the I've thought about this for a long time. It's not a perfect theory, of course, and I think it's more of the start of a wider discussion. But it is. I was reminded of this because of the very recent. It's almost the end of September of 2025. The very recent, of course, murder of Charlie Kirk, and then beyond that, the new debate that has come up about free speech. Because in the internims, is that the right word? I don't know. I don't care. There, since his murder, what has happened and has really been the crux of this new issue is that Jimmy Kimmel, who well, I've been told he's a comedian. There's no evidence of this, but I've been told. So we must believe what we are told. So he was supposedly a comedian, and he was basically just fired from his late night show. Now, the late night show didn't really have great ratings, so there's plenty of reasons that he probably was fired beyond the the surface level. But the FCC had a bit to do with it, which is to say the federal government. So there has been a bunch of noise about who is on the side of free speech and who isn't. Because the left is now all on the side of free speech. They are reading out the First Amendment as if they've ever read it before or cared. Now they care. They're putting on like vigils, and people are stopping in their tracks and saying the world is going to end because Jimmy Kimmel has been canceled. And the right, as I alluded to, the federal government has gotten into it a bit. And unfortunately, there have been some choice remarks, so to speak, from Pam Bondi, who's the Attorney General, who, I kid you not, actually did say that did reference the phrase hate speech, a deliberately leftist term that she then used as what, well, I don't think she went anywhere with it, but it was more the like she didn't start prosecuting anyone for it, but the idea was that she, being the Attorney General of the United States and the conservative side, chose to use a leftist term to try to limit free speech over, I believe it was also the Charlie Kirk murder, because you are not allowed at the moment to criticize him because he was murdered, which my personal take is that, calling for someone's death is probably already a crime and continues to be one, and we should treat it as such. But you are actually allowed to disagree with people post mortem. We disagree with plenty of people post mortem. That is not an issue. But anyway, so the left has become very into free speech, and the right has become not so into free speech. They're the FCC chair, which is really where a lot of this started to spark up, was basically threatening local television affiliates to cancel Jimmy Kimmel on their own late night rosters, and they whether whether they acquiesce to him or not is not really the point, although there is important points there as well. It's that the right is now kind of anti-free speech. There's a lot of friction there, and the left is pro-free speech. And if you have any memory at all about the political landscape for basically the last 15 years at least, it's been the opposite. And I think this is actually quite interesting because, I'm not going to pretend I know that much about the 1900s, having not been born during them. But it seemed to me that this current paradigm of the left being pro free speech and the right being against was also the same back in the late 1900s and mid 1900s even, like the whole hippie Woodstock stuff, and of course the anti Vietnam War protests. So Why the switches? Why do they keep switching around? Like, are you actually pro free speech or are you anti free speech? It is the First Amendment in the Constitution. So one would think that you would have a strong position on it if you have any position at all. And yet, none of them do. Oh, very few. There are some people who do. I would like to consider myself among them. All right. But a lot of people are very shaky. I think the conservatives are a little less shaky, but not as sturdy as one would like them to be. And I think the reason for these switches, and I think there's been a lot of at least supposed ideological switches over the years. And people will say that it's because others have no principles. Of course, I, as the political right person, I have the right opinions, and my opponents have no principles whatsoever. They are just flocking children or something. Yes, so I think that's the opinion a lot of people actually do hold. But the interesting thing is that they switch. And I think the reason they switch has nothing to do with them having no principles. It's because they have principles, but those principles are just not flattering. The principles kind of in the end are that conservatives, which is a word that they self-identify as, so it's not like I'm taking them out of context. They all call themselves conservatives on the right, at least mostly. I mean, of course, there's not the point. So, and what that means is conserve, as in keep things the same or return things to what was. I think there's a little less of that can start to bleed into, well, what I'm about to get to. But essentially, the right's instinct is to keep things the same. That is their principle. Their principle, all these other little issues that we argue about nonsensically for days and years and forever, and we go back and forth on policy, people don't care about those. They just don't. Those are not the real issues. Those are the fake issues, because it's not exactly flattering to go out there and say, you see, I don't care about your freedoms or your liberties, or your speech or your money or your country. I just care about keeping everything the same. Like that doesn't sound very good. And the left is kind of similar. They are, and this is a word that some of them might fight over a little bit, but they would call themselves progressives. Now, of course, there's the middle ground leftists, but we have to talk about the real left and not the people who are kind of just floating off in the river. So, the progressives, as the word suggests, mean change. Progress is change. Because obviously, if you stayed the same, that's not progress. And the reason they call it progressive rather than just different is because progressive is the positive variation of change. Because obviously, like decay is change. Nobody's the party of decay because they don't want bad change. They want good change, progress. And that means that their principle similarly has nothing to do with free speech or any freedoms whatsoever. All it has to do with is, are we making the world a better place? Now, there's a lot of different, similar to the conservative side, obviously there are good things that are conserved and there are bad things that are conserved. And the left would like to change some things that are good and a lot of things which are bad. Of course, I'm biased because I'm kind of to the right. So both sides are guided by principles that they won't talk about. They won't talk about them at parties. I think oftentimes don't even understand that those are their real principles. So then we get to this switch, and it's very obvious the switch happened very quickly. Like during COVID, the left, the party of the working man, for instance, very quickly became totally anti-working man, threw them all out, and threw them all out of their jobs so they couldn't make a living, and basically went around censoring people. If you looked at the polls, censorship being the government position, but like polls of leftists during COVID were basically, oh, you're You disagree with the vaccine. Well, you should go be put in a camp. Like, that's not, that doesn't sound very freedom oriented or even very progress oriented, but I think they thought it was progress. And in a lot of ways, given that COVID given that the COVID policy was largely directed by left-leaning ideology, I would think that they thought that the changes they were making were actually progress, mostly because they were disrupting the system. Oh, if we can have everyone out of their jobs and everyone just on the government teat and everything is still fine, that must mean that we don't need free trade. We don't need freedom at all. Everyone can finally be happy and reality does not have to exist. And I guess that's a bit of a rant. But the point being that when people are talking about these issues, you have to understand where they're really coming from, because if you don't, then you're going to be confused. Because everyone has been going around yelling, hypocrite, hypocrite, why are you such a hypocrite? They're not hypocrites. They're just not telling you the truth to begin with. Like, the left cares about freedom of speech right now, as in when it serves the revolution, when it serves the progress, because they think that whenever they are winning, they are making progress. So if freedom of speech is helping that progress, then they are pro-freedom of speech. And if you notice, they're not in power. And freedom of speech is by definition a bonus to those who are not in power. I thought I was going to say that more cleverly, but it's okay. And of course, the right is now a little bit anti-free speech, or at least is dilly-dallying in that field. I don't know. Weird word. They're at least they're okay. I'm trying to find an analogy, and I just can't. They're flirting with it. There we go. They're flirting with not being pro-free speech, and that flirtation comes from their feeling that they are in power, and therefore that the freedom of speech of others is a threat. Because, of course, freedom of speech, you usually aren't exercising your freedom of speech in the way in which it would be protected from threat, because you're saying, I need everything to stay exactly the same. Like, nobody needs their freedom of speech to say that. You need your freedom of speech to say things should be different. And right now, the right doesn't want things to be different. They're very comfortable. They're very comfortable in power, and therefore, now they're a little against free speech. Now, unfortunately, I feel like I've drawn enough of a diagram, so to speak, a verbal diagram, for you to start to understand why people believe the things they do in like specific policies. Like the left, the second they're back in power, just as we saw during COVID, free speech, that is hate speech, as Pam Bondi said from the right. Like the left is very, very pro-censorship. And I think that comes from their ideology being a lot more unrealistic. Of course, there's two sides of that. In that, on the one hand, leftism itself is always less realistic, because what you're saying is we are going to make something that was never before. We are going to make the utopia. There's never been a utopia, so how are you going to make it? So it is by definition less plausible than the right, because the right is basically, let's just keep everything the same. That's plausible. It's very believable. So the left always has a stronger pro-censorship instinct when they are in power, whereas the right has a weaker one, but it still exists, because if they feel threatened, as I think a lot of people on the right do since the assassination, they would like to see the threat go away. Because that is a fundamental nature of conservatism. Conserving, keeping everything the same. If something is put out of balance, they want to force it back into balance. And if they have to take late night shows off the air, or I wouldn't say put people in jail, because I think that starts to disrupt. Because that's the thing about conservatism, is that they can't do anything too crazy when they're in power because then they feel like they're disrupting their own norm. So they're kind of stuck in this bubble. Whereas we see whenever the left is in power, they will do so much stuff. They will reorganize the government itself. And when conservatives get into power, it's like, let's just like move this like over here on the shelf and move that over there and just let's just tidy up. They're very hesitant to make big changes. And the founders were kind of hesitant to make big changes too, hence the whole Constitution and the way in which it is usually very hard to change. So I don't know where I'm going with this now, but I guess the point of this video was simply to draw some of the borders that we're working with. That when we think about the left and the right, and you say, oh, these are policies on the right and these are policies on the left, they are incidental. Nearly all of them are incidental. Like, as I pointed out, freedom of speech is something that the left is more eager to crack down on because when you're trying to convince someone of something that is kind of implausible, you don't want someone arguing with you. So, therefore, the left is less secure in their ideology and in their feeling of rulership and their confidence in what they'll be able to make. And the thing about making changes is if you make bad changes, people might not like those changes, and then you're out of power. So there are some proclivities within the parties based on their core ideology, being conservation or progress. Wow. I'm looking at a squirrel right now, and it has like a full mouth of nuts. Anyway, maybe it's a chipmunk. Who cares? That the parties have proclivities towards certain sides of each issue. But those proclivities tend to be kind of weak. Sometimes they're strong, but usually they are on the weaker side. And most of the issues that people are going on about are actually just inherited. They come from an experience in life, or, well, there's only three places issues come from. One, it was what your parents believed, basically. It's what the party believed in the past, so we have to believe it in the present. Two, it is influenced by the core ideology, for instance, the freedom of speech thing I just mentioned. And three is basically personal experience. If your sister was murdered by an illegal immigrant, you're now against illegal immigration. Like that's just happening. Doesn't matter what party you're on. And oftentimes you'll actually switch parties because that becomes a much more important issue for you and a much more defining core issue. So, yeah, I guess I think I just reviewed everything, but I think this was a really good exercise, and I hope it's the start of a longer conversation because it would be a useful exercise to map the exact core ideology of each party. I think I've defined it decently, but I think there's more work to do as well. And then to go through each proclivity and figure out each issue and figure out which side has more proclivity towards it and against it. So just to get a better sense of how politics works in the world, and therefore hopefully to be less influenced by our base beliefs and think more about why we believe the things we do. So anyway, I think this went quite well, and I will talk to you next time. Please like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell. I should do some like fun animation for that eventually. But yeah, please watch it, share it. I appreciate it, and leave a comment. I want to hear what you have to say. Bye.